The air above the old well was thick, not with the usual humidity of a Mississippi summer, but with a palpable stillness, a heavy quiet, that had settled over Voss Hill for 2 decades. It was a silence born of secrets, a hush that clung to the ancient stones and the gnarled roots of the cypress trees. Edmund Voss, his hands calloused and his brow furrowed, felt the immense weight of the massive, flat stone slab that had sealed the well for 20 years. It wasn't just the physical burden of the rock, but the invisible pressure of unspoken histories, of a town's collective amnesia. When the first groan of iron on stone echoed across the desolate fields, a shiver ran through the few onlookers. A faint, earthy scent, like damp soil and forgotten things, began to rise, carrying with it the chilling promise that what lay beneath was far more than just stagnant water. The town of Rayford had held its breath for 20 years, and now, as the seal finally broke, it seemed to hold it once more, waiting for the truth to finally surface. Before we continue with the story of the Voss Plantation, make sure to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. The year was 1887, and the Mississippi sun beat down with an unforgiving intensity, baking the red clay roads into a fine, choking dust. Edmund Voss, a man whose 38 years had etched lines of weariness around his eyes, guided his horse-drawn buggy along the familiar yet strangely alien path toward Voss Hill. 5 years he had spent in Memphis, working as a land surveyor, meticulously mapping out parcels of earth, trying to impose order on a world that felt increasingly chaotic. 5 years he had tried to forget the sprawling, decaying cotton plantation that bore his family's name, the place where he had grown up under the shadow of a father whose presence was as imposing as the grand, now crumbling manor house itself. His father, Harlan Voss, had died in 1882, leaving behind a legacy of debt and disrepair. The once thriving fields, which had stretched for hundreds of acres, were now largely untended, choked with weeds and wild growth. The grand house, Voss Hill, once a beacon of antebellum prosperity, stood like a skeletal monument to a bygone era. Its paint peeling, its shutters hanging askew, its once manicured gardens swallowed by the encroaching wilderness. Edmund had returned to Claiborne County, not out of sentimentality, but out of necessity. A northern land company, with an eye toward timber and potential future development, had expressed interest in the property. It was a chance, perhaps the only chance, to salvage something from the wreckage of his inheritance. He needed to assess the land, to put a value on the ghosts that haunted every acre before the sale could proceed. The journey itself was a slow, arduous affair. The dust, fine as flour, coated everything, his clothes, his skin, the very air he breathed. It tasted of dry earth and forgotten promises. The rhythmic creak of the buggy wheels and the steady clip-clop of the horses' hooves were the only sounds that broke the oppressive silence of the rural landscape. As he drew closer to Rayford, the small, sleepy town that served the surrounding plantations, a hollow feeling began to settle in his chest. It was the peculiar ache of returning to a place you had desperately tried to leave behind, only to find it waiting for you, unchanged in its essence, yet utterly transformed by time and neglect. Rayford itself seemed to have aged, its wooden storefronts leaning more precariously, its streets quieter than he remembered. The locals, many of whom had known him since he was a boy, greeted him with a peculiar mix of deference and unease. Their smiles were thin, their eyes quick to dart away when he met their gaze. There was a palpable tension in the air, a collective unspoken understanding that he, Edmund Voss, was now inextricably linked to the decaying legacy of Voss Hill. He tried to engage them in casual conversation, asking about the old days, about the changes in the county, but their responses were clipped, evasive. It was as if a silent pact had been made, a conspiracy of silence that he, as an outsider, was not privy to. One afternoon, while inspecting the dilapidated barns, Edmund encountered Silas Pruitt. Silas, Now a man in his early 70s, his frame stooped and his face a roadmap of sun-baked wrinkles, had served as the overseer for Harlan Voss for decades. He was a man whose loyalty had been absolute, his methods often brutal, but always effective in his father's eyes. Silas was still living in a small cabin on the edge of the property, a relic of the old order, clinging to the land like a stubborn weed. "Young Mr. Voss," Silas rasped, his voice gravelly with age and years of tobacco. He squinted at Edmund, his eyes, though rheumy, still holding a spark of their former sharpness. "Didn't think you'd be back." "The land company, Silas," Edmund replied, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Got to assess the property." Silas nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward the distant, overgrown fields. "Aye, the land, always the land." He paused, then his eyes flickered back to Edmund, a strange, almost fearful glint in them. There's some things best left undisturbed, Mr. Voss. Some corners of this place, you might want to leave that one alone." Edmund, preoccupied with the daunting task of cataloguing the vast, neglected estate, had brushed off Silas's cryptic warning. He assumed the old man was referring to some particularly stubborn patch of briars or perhaps a collapsing structure that wasn't worth the effort. He thanked Silas and continued his work, making notes in his ledger, sketching out boundaries, trying to make sense of the tangled mess that was Voss Hill. It was a few days later, while meticulously mapping the area around the former slave quarters, now little more than crumbling foundations and scattered timbers, that he saw it. The well. It sat in a clearing, partially obscured by a thick curtain of kudzu and wild grapevines, but unmistakably there. It wasn't just a well, it was a monument to something deliberately hidden. A massive flat stone, easily 5 feet in diameter and a foot thick, lay flush with the ground, completely sealing the opening. Around its perimeter, heavy iron spikes, thick as a man's wrist, had been driven deep into the earth, pinning the stone in place. Over 20 years, the vines and moss had crept over the stone, weaving themselves through the iron, creating a natural yet sinister shroud. Something about it didn't look like a normal well seal. It looked like a tombstone. It looked like a prison. A cold dread began to prickle at the back of Edmund's neck. He tried to dismiss it, to rationalize it. Perhaps it was a safety measure, a way to prevent accidents on a deserted property. But the sheer scale of the sealing, the deliberate, almost violent nature of the iron spikes, suggested something far more sinister. He returned to Rayford that evening. The image of the sealed well burned into his mind. He tried asking again, more directly this time, about the well. He inquired at the general store, at the blacksmith shop, even at the small, dusty saloon. "That old well up at Voss Hill," he'd begin, trying to sound casual. "Why was it sealed up, do you know?" The reactions were always the same. A sudden shift in conversation, a quick glance away, a mumbled excuse about not knowing or it being before my time, even from men who had lived in Rayford their entire lives. The silence was deafening, a collective refusal to acknowledge a truth that everyone in town seemed to know, yet no one dared to speak. Edmund Voss, the land surveyor, was used to uncovering hidden boundaries and forgotten markers. But this was different. This was a boundary of silence, a marker of fear, and it was beginning to consume him. The town of Rayford, Edmund quickly discovered, guarded its secrets with the fierce devotion of a religious sect. The silence surrounding the sealed well at Voss Hill was not merely a lack of information, it was an active, almost aggressive, refusal to speak. Every inquiry he made was met with a wall of averted gazes, mumbled platitudes, or outright changes of subject. The general store owner would suddenly find an urgent need to restock shelves. The blacksmith would begin hammering a piece of iron with renewed vigor, drowning out Edmund's questions. Even the old men who sat on the porch of the saloon, usually eager to spin tales of the past, would grow quiet, their eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the horizon. It was a chilling display of collective amnesia, a town-wide conspiracy of silence that only deepened Edmund's resolve. He realized that if he wanted answers, he couldn't rely on the spoken word. He would have to dig, not into the earth, but into the dusty archives of the county. His first stop was the county clerk's office in Rayford, a small, cramped room filled with towering stacks of ledgers and brittle, yellowed documents. The clerk, a thin, nervous man named Mr. Abernathy, seemed particularly uncomfortable with Edmund's presence, his hands fluttering over papers as if trying to hide something. Edmund spent days poring over records, his surveyor's eye for detail serving him well. He sifted through property deeds, tax assessments, and official reports, searching for any mention of Voss Hill, of his father, or of the well. His persistence eventually paid off. Tucked away in a ledger marked Public Health and Sanitation Reports, 1865-1870, he found it. An official report, dated July 14, 1867, filed by Harlan Voss. The report stated in formal bureaucratic language that the well water at Voss Hill had become unfit for consumption, likely due to a miasmatic condition of the soil. It recommended immediate sealing to prevent the spread of disease. Edmund stared at the date, July 14, 1867. 20 years ago, almost to the day. The miasmatic condition explanation struck him as vague, almost deliberately so. It was a common enough theory in the mid-19th century, attributing disease to bad air, but it felt like a convenient catch-all, a way to explain away something without truly explaining it. He remembered something else from his childhood, something his father had rarely spoken of, but which had been a quiet, persistent presence on the plantation in the immediate aftermath of the war. A small community of formerly enslaved people had chosen to remain on the Voss Hill grounds. They had stayed on, not as property, but as free laborers, working the fields, trying to rebuild their lives in the shattered landscape of the post-war South. There had been about 14 of them, men, women, and children, a self-contained community that had persisted through 1866 and into 1867. Edmund, as a boy, had occasionally seen them, heard their voices from the quarters, a distant hum of life that had abruptly ceased. He decided to broaden his search to the Freedmen's Bureau records. The Bureau had maintained an active office in nearby Port Gibson during Reconstruction, tasked with assisting formerly enslaved people in their transition to freedom. It was a long, dusty ride to Port Gibson, but Edmund felt a growing urgency. He spent another week in the Bureau's archives, a more organized but equally neglected collection of documents. He found records of labor contracts, land disputes, and requests for aid. He meticulously cross-referenced names, dates, and locations, and then he found the gap. In a register of residents and laborers associated with Claiborne County plantations, under the heading Voss Hill Plantation, he located 14 names. They were entered in the spring of 1867, but there were no subsequent records, no entries indicating they had moved away, no new labor contracts, no requests for assistance from other counties. Crucially, there were no death certificates. They simply vanished from the official record. 14 names entered and then nothing. It was as if they had been erased from existence. Edmund's training as a surveyor, his instinct for patterns and anomalies screamed at him. This wasn't a clerical error. This was a deliberate void. He returned to Voss Hill, the miasma report and the missing names swirling in his mind. He walked the grounds again, his gaze now fixed on the sealed well. It sat at the very center of what had once been the bustling heart of the slave quarters, surrounded by the faint outlines of cabins, the communal cooking fires, the small plots where families had tried to grow their own food. The location was chillingly precise. He remembered the county physician's log, Dr. Horace Gage. He had seen a brief, almost dismissive entry in the county records. He went back to the clerk's office, insisting on seeing Dr. Gage's personal logs, a collection of leather-bound books that Mr. Abernathy reluctantly produced from a locked cabinet. After hours of searching, Edmund found it. A single entry, dated July 16, 1867, 2 days after Harlan Voss filed his miasma report. The entry was brief, almost cryptic. Visited Voss Hill. found no evidence of disease, though conditions were irregular. Conditions were irregular. The phrase echoed in Edmund's mind, a chilling understatement that spoke volumes. It wasn't a medical diagnosis, it was an observation, a judgment, a carefully worded evasion. What conditions had Dr. Gage found? What had been so irregular that it warranted such a peculiar, almost coded description? The phrase would haunt Edmund for weeks, a persistent whisper in the back of his thoughts, a silent accusation from the past. The well, sealed and silent, seemed to mock his efforts, daring him to uncover the truth that Rayford had so carefully buried. The silence of Rayford was a formidable barrier, but Edmund Voss was a man accustomed to breaking ground. He understood that official records, while crucial, often told only a fraction of the story. The true narrative, he suspected, lay in the memories of those who had lived through that time, those who had witnessed the events of 1867 from the periphery. His search eventually led him to Ruth. Ruth lived in a small weathered cabin on the very edge of Rayford, nestled amongst a grove of ancient pecan trees. Her home was humble, but meticulously kept, a testament to a life of quiet resilience. She was an elderly black woman, her face a tapestry of wrinkles. Her eyes, though clouded by age, still held a deep, knowing intelligence. She had been a young woman in 1867, barely out of her teens, working as a laundress for one of the more prominent families in Rayford. She had seen much, heard more, and understood even more than she let on. Edmund approached her with caution and respect, explaining his purpose, the mystery of the well, the missing names. Ruth listened patiently, her hands, gnarled with age, resting in her lap. For a long time, she said nothing, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the cabin's window. Edmund felt the weight of her silence, the decades of unspoken truths that lay behind it. Slowly, hesitantly at first, then with a growing clarity, Ruth began to speak. Her voice was soft, raspy, but each word carried the weight of memory. She spoke of the community at Voss Hill, the 14 souls who had stayed on after the war, clinging to the hope of a new life. She spoke of Delia. Delia, Ruth explained, was a woman in her late 30s, a figure of quiet strength and unwavering resolve. She had been the main house cook at Voss Hill for years, a position that had given her a unique understanding of the plantation's inner workings, its rhythms, and its secrets. More than that, Delia was the de facto leader of the group, a natural matriarch who possessed both a keen intellect and a compassionate heart. She was the one who organized their labor, mediated disputes, and most importantly, held their collective hope in her steady hands. She couldn't read or write herself, but she understood the power of words, the necessity of documentation in a world that sought to deny their very humanity. Her husband was August, a man of quiet dignity and immense skill. August was a carpenter, his hands capable of coaxing beauty from raw timber. He had built many of the cabins in the quarters, repaired the plantation's fences, and crafted furniture for the main house. He was Delia's rock, her steadfast partner, and a respected figure within their small community. Together, they had 3 children. Nora, a bright and curious girl of about 12, already showing signs of her mother's intelligence. Thomas, a spirited boy of 9, full of youthful energy. And Clara, a baby, barely a year old, a symbol of their fragile future. There was also Hamp, August's older brother, a man whose quiet strength belied a limp from an old injury sustained during his years as a field hand. Hamp was a man of few words, but his presence was a comforting anchor for the others. And then there was Rosalie, a young woman of about 20, whose spirit burned with an unquenchable thirst for knowledge. Rosalie had, against all odds and in defiance of the laws that had once forbidden it, taught herself to read. She had done so in secret, using a worn, leather-bound Bible that had belonged to the plantation mistress, carefully deciphering the words by the flickering light of a stolen candle. Rosalie was the community's scribe, their connection to the written world, their voice on paper. The other 7 names, Ruth admitted, were harder to recall with perfect clarity. They were faces in a fading memory, echoes of lives lived and lost. She remembered a young couple, Cornelius and Nettie, who had recently married and dreamed of owning their own small farm. There was an older woman, Martha, whose wisdom was sought by all, and a quiet young man named Samuel, known for his gentle way with animals. The rest were children, their names now blurred by time, but their presence in that small community, their hopes and fears, were as real as the dust on the road. It was Rosalie, at Delia's direction, who had penned the letter that would ultimately seal their fate. Edmund found a copy of it in the county archives, a fragile, yellowed sheet of paper, its elegant script a stark contrast to the brutal reality it described. It was dated April 3rd, 1867. The letter, addressed to the Freedmen's Bureau in Port Gibson, was a masterpiece of dignified appeal. It formally requested recognition of the group's labor contract with Harlan Voss, detailing the terms they had agreed upon for working the 1866 harvest. Crucially, it also asked for consideration for land allotment under the Southern Homestead Act of 1866, a federal law that offered public lands to freed people. The letter was signed by Delia, August, Hamp, and Cornelius, their marks carefully placed beside Rosalie's flowing script. The letter was not an act of defiance, but an act of faith. It was a belief in the promise of freedom, in the rule of law, in the possibility of a just future. It calmly stated that Harlan Voss had refused to honor the agreed-upon wages for the 1866 harvest, leaving them in a precarious position. It was a plea for help, a formal assertion of their rights as free citizens. Harlan Voss received a copy of this letter on approximately April 10, 1867. The speed of his reaction was telling. Within 2 weeks he had made the journey to Port Gibson and met privately with the local Freedmen's Bureau agent, a man named Colton Farris. Farris was known throughout the county as a man who, despite his official position, was deeply sympathetic to the plight of the local planters. He understood their difficulties in adjusting to the new labor system, their losses after the war. He was, in essence, a man who served two masters, and his loyalty often leaned toward the powerful white landowners who held sway in the region. Ruth's voice grew softer as she spoke of this period, her eyes distant. She described the palpable shift in the atmosphere around Voss Hill after that letter was sent. A quiet tension, a sense of foreboding that settled over the land like a heavy fog. The politics of Reconstruction Mississippi were a brutal reality. The promise of black land ownership, of true economic independence, was met with fierce hostility by former Confederates who saw it as an affront to their very way of life. The vulnerability of Delia, August, Rosalie, and the others was immense. They were 14 souls, standing on the precipice of a new world, armed only with hope and a piece of paper, against the entrenched power of a system determined to keep them in their place. Ruth's words painted a vivid, heartbreaking picture of their courage, their dreams, and the insidious forces gathering against them. Harlan Voss was not a man given to grand pronouncements or theatrical displays of anger. His power was far more insidious, rooted in a cold, calculating pragmatism that had served him well throughout his life. Edmund, through his father's old ledgers and the hushed whispers of the town, began to piece together the portrait of a man who, in 1867, was teetering on the brink of ruin. The war had stripped him of his most valuable assets, his enslaved workforce, and the subsequent economic upheaval had left his once vast cotton empire deeply in debt. He was a man who genuinely believed in the old order, in the inherent rightness of white supremacy and the natural subservience of black people. The idea of his former property not only demanding wages but also asserting a claim to land under federal law was not just an economic threat. It was a profound personal affront, a challenge to his very identity and status. He was terrified of debt, of losing Voss Hill, of becoming a pariah among his peers. This fear, coupled with a deep-seated paranoia about the changing world, made him a dangerous man. He saw the Freedmen's Bureau, and indeed the entire Reconstruction government, as an illegitimate imposition, a foreign body attempting to dismantle the fabric of Southern society. He had allies, of course. Men in Rayford and Port Gibson who shared his views, who felt the same gnawing fear of a world turned upside down. They were the local magistrates, the merchants, the other planters, all bound by a common interest in maintaining the racial hierarchy and their economic dominance. Harlan's problem, however, was a practical one. Delia and her community were legally free. Their letter to the Bureau, meticulously penned by Rosalie, created a paper trail, a formal record of their grievances and their claims. The Southern Homestead Act, though often circumvented, technically offered them a pathway to land ownership. This was a direct challenge to Harlan's authority, a precedent he could not allow to stand. The summer of 1867 in Claiborne County was a season of oppressive heat and simmering tension. The air hung heavy and humid, broken only by the buzzing of cicadas and the distant rumble of thunder. Edmund imagined his father during those months, his movements becoming more frequent, more clandestine. Harlan would ride out from Voss Hill, not to inspect his fields, but to meet with men in hushed tones, in the back rooms of stores or under the shade of ancient oaks. He met with Silas Pruitt repeatedly, the overseer's loyalty unwavering, his willingness to carry out Harlan's bidding absolute. Silas, a man whose life had been defined by enforcing Harlan's will, would have seen any challenge to his master as a challenge to his own existence. More disturbingly, Harlan also met with Dr. Horace Gage, the county physician. Dr. Gage was a man of science, or so he presented himself, but he was also, Edmund discovered through careful cross-referencing of old county records and a few discreet inquiries, a quiet but active member of a local organization that operated under the innocuous name of the Rayford Protective League. This was no mere social club. The League was a thinly veiled clan-adjacent group, a network of white men dedicated to preserving order and protecting Southern values, euphemisms for suppressing black advancement and maintaining white supremacy through intimidation and violence. Edmund found a single chilling reference to the League in a collection of letters from a Methodist circuit preacher. The preacher, who had visited Rayford in 1868, wrote to his denomination's leadership about organized terror operating in the name of order in the county, detailing instances of threats, property destruction, and disappearances aimed at discouraging freed people from voting or acquiring land. The preacher, a man of God, had been deeply disturbed by what he witnessed, but his words, like so many others, had been largely ignored by the wider world. Between June and July of 1867, as the cotton plants grew tall and the heat became almost unbearable, something happened at Voss Hill, something that the town of Rayford, collectively and deliberately, chose not to see. The details remained shrouded, obscured by the passage of time and the impenetrable wall of silence. But the pieces were beginning to fit together for Edmund. His father's fear, the letter from Delia, the complicity of Silas Pruitt, the involvement of Dr. Gage, and the sinister shadow of the Rayford Protective League. The sealed well, Edmund realized with a growing sense of dread, was not just a cover for contaminated water. It was a monument to a crime, a silent witness to a truth that had been buried alive. The suspense tightened around him, a cold knot in his stomach, as he knew, with chilling certainty, that he was about to unearth something far more disturbing than he had ever imagined. The decision to open the well was not made lightly. For weeks, Edmund had wrestled with the implications, the potential consequences of disturbing a 20-year-old secret. The town's silence, Silas Pruitt's cryptic warning, Dr. Gage's unsettling entry, and Ruth's fragmented memories had woven a tapestry of dread around the sealed stone. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that this was no mere investigation into contaminated water. This was an excavation of a crime, a deliberate act of erasure. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on him, but the surveyor's instinct, the relentless pursuit of truth, would not let him turn away. He couldn't ask anyone from Rayford to help. The silence was too deep, the fear too ingrained. Instead, he rode several miles out of the county to a small, isolated farm where he knew two brothers, Thomas and William Hayes, lived. They were quiet, hard-working men, known for their strength and their discretion, and crucially, they had no ties to Rayford or the Voss family. He offered them a generous sum, explaining only that he needed help moving a very heavy stone. They agreed, their faces impassive, their questions unasked. The morning of the excavation dawned clear and hot, the kind of day where the air shimmered above the fields. Edmund, Thomas and William arrived at the well with a wagon loaded with tools. Heavy iron bars, thick ropes, a sturdy wooden tripod, and a block and tackle. The well sat in its clearing, still shrouded in kudzu, the iron spikes now clearly visible beneath the tangled vines. It looked less like a well and more like a forgotten altar, a place where something sacred had been entombed. The process was arduous, a slow, deliberate battle against time and nature. First, they had to clear away the dense overgrowth, hacking through thick vines that had woven themselves into a formidable net around the stone. The iron spikes, rusted and pitted, were almost swallowed by the earth. It took hours of back-breaking labor to dig them out, each spike groaning as it was pried from its 20-year slumber. The scrape of iron on stone, the dull thud of the crowbar against the earth, were the only sounds that broke the oppressive quiet. As the last spike was removed, a faint, earthy smell, distinct from the usual dampness of the soil, began to rise. It was a smell of deep earth, of stagnant water, but also something else, something indefinable, ancient, and unsettling. Edmund felt a prickle of unease crawl up his spine. They rigged the block and tackled to the sturdy wooden tripod, carefully positioning the ropes around the massive stone slab. Thomas and William, their muscles straining, began to pull. The stone, resisting at first, then slowly, agonizingly, began to shift. A low, grinding groan, like the earth itself sighing in protest, echoed through the clearing. As the stone lifted, a rush of air, cool and damp, surged from the depths of the well. It carried with it that peculiar, unsettling scent, now stronger, more defined. The sound changed too. The chirping of cicadas seemed to dim, the rustle of leaves to hush, as if nature itself was holding its breath. With a final mighty heave, the stone cover was swung clear, crashing to the ground with a dull thud that sent birds scattering from the nearby trees. The well, dark and gaping, lay exposed. Edmund peered into the blackness, a chill running through him despite the oppressive heat. The water level was low, far below what he remembered from his childhood. The air that rose from it was heavy, thick with the smell of decay and something else, something metallic and old. He lowered a lantern into the shaft. The flickering light struggled against the profound darkness, revealing only a murky expanse of water far below. He then lowered a weighted line, measuring the depth. It was deeper than he had anticipated, almost 40 feet to the water's surface. "I'll need to go down," Edmund stated, his voice sounding strangely hollow in the sudden quiet. Thomas and William exchanged a glance but said nothing. They secured a sturdy rope around Edmund's waist, testing its strength. He took a deep breath, the scent from the well filling his lungs, and began his descent. The air grew colder, heavier as he descended. The walls of the well were slick with moss and ancient moisture. The lantern cast dancing shadows, making the darkness seem to press in on him from all sides. He reached the water's surface, his boots splashing softly. The water was still, black, reflecting the lantern light like a shattered mirror. He scanned the bottom, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. And then he saw them. Beneath decades of silt and standing water, partially submerged, were bundles. They were wrapped in oilcloth, a heavy, waxed canvas, bound tightly with thick wire. They lay scattered across the bottom, dark, indistinct shapes against the murky floor. Edmund's breath hitched in his throat. This was it. This was what the town had buried. He carefully reached down, his fingers brushing against the cold, slick oilcloth. He pulled one bundle free, its weight surprisingly substantial. He signaled to the men above, and they slowly began to hoist him up, the bundle clutched tightly in his hand. Back on solid ground, Edmund laid the bundle on the grass. His hands trembled slightly as he began to unwrap the oilcloth. The wire, rusted but still strong, resisted his efforts. Finally, with a sharp tug, it gave way. The oilcloth peeled back, revealing not bones, not bodies, but something far more chilling in its implications. Documents. The first bundle contained a collection of brittle, yellowed papers. They were damp, but remarkably preserved by the oilcloth and the cool, anaerobic environment of the well. He carefully spread them out. There was a folded copy of a labor contract, identical to the one Delia had referenced in her letter to the Freedmen's Bureau. The very contract Harlan Voss had claimed never existed. There were affidavit pages bearing what appeared to be signatures, though faded, attesting to the terms of the agreement and the non-payment of wages. His hands shook as he reached for the second bundle. This one was smaller, more compact. As he unwrapped it, he found a small, waterproof tin box. It was old, its metal tarnished, but it was sealed tight. With a grunt of effort, he pried it open. Inside, nestled amongst more carefully wrapped papers, was a journal. It was a small, leather-bound book, its pages filled with elegant flowing script. Delia's journal, he realized, or rather Rosalie's careful handwriting rendering Delia's words. He opened it to a random page, his eyes scanning the words. A voice from the past suddenly speaking to him. And then beneath the journal, he found it. A single sheet of paper folded multiple times, its edges softened by time. It was a list of 14 names written in pencil in Delia's own hand. The paper, though fragile, had been preserved by the dry cold of the well's depth and the meticulous oilcloth wrapping. He read them aloud, his voice barely a whisper. Delia, August, Nora, Thomas, Clara, Hamp, Rosalie, Cornelius, Nettie, Martha, Samuel, and 3 other names less distinct but undeniably there. 14 names, including the baby Clara. The miasma report, the silence of Rayford, the irregular conditions. It all coalesced into a single, horrifying truth. The well had not been sealed to contain disease. It had been sealed to contain evidence. What do you think Edmund will do with these shocking discoveries? Share your theories in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button if you're gripped by this story. Edmund returned to Ruth's cabin, the tin box clutched in his hand, the weight of its contents pressing down on him. He laid the documents on her small, worn table, spreading them out carefully. The labor contract, the affidavits, and most chillingly Delia's list of 14 names. Ruth, her eyes wide, peered at the papers, her gaze lingering on the familiar script of Rosalie in the journal, and then on Delia's own careful pencil marks on the list. A low moan escaped her lips, a sound of deep sorrow and long-held pain. "I knew," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I always knew." But no one would listen. No one would speak. Edmund urged her to tell him everything, to finally break the silence that had suffocated Rayford for 2 decades. Ruth, her hands trembling, began to recount the events of that fateful summer, her memories now sharpened by the tangible proof before her. She was approximately 75 years old in 1887, but in 1867 she'd been a young woman, living just outside the plantation boundary, close enough to hear the sounds of Voss Hill, but far enough to be considered outside its immediate sphere of influence. She worked as a laundress for a family in Rayford, walking the dusty roads daily, observing the subtle shifts in the town's atmosphere. "It was July," Ruth began, her voice gaining strength as the memories flooded back. "The heat was terrible, just like it is now. But there was another kind of heat, a bad feeling hanging over Voss Hill. Mr. Harlan, he was riding around more than usual, meeting with folks, his face tight like a drum. And Silas Pruitt, he was always at his heels like a shadow." She spoke of the nights. "I heard the wagons, Mr. Voss. Not the regular farm wagons, but heavy ones, moving slow late at night. 2 nights I heard them in the middle of July. The first night I heard voices low and gruff, and then a different sound, like something heavy being dragged. And then the second night it was quieter, just the wagons and then nothing. Ruth described the chilling silence that followed. After that second night, there was no more singing from the quarters, no children laughing, no sound of Delia's cooking fire, just quiet, a deep, unnatural quiet. The next morning, driven by a gnawing unease, Ruth had walked to the edge of the road that bordered Voss Hill, near where the quarters stood. What she saw, or rather, what she didn't see, confirmed her worst fears. The quarters were empty, utterly, completely empty. Every pot, every cloth, every small, cherished possession they had owned, gone. It was as if the 14 souls had simply vanished into thin air. And the well, Ruth continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. The well, which had been open and in use the day before, where Delia would draw water for her cooking, where the children would play nearby, it was covered. That big stone, just like you found it, and the spikes. It was like they wanted to make sure no one ever looked inside. She had told no one for 20 years. The fear had been too great, the consequences too dire. She had seen what happened to others who dared to speak out, to challenge the established order. She had witnessed the swift, brutal retribution meted out by men like Harlan Voss and the shadowy figures of the Rayford Protective League. Her silence had been a matter of survival. As she finished her story, Ruth reached into the pocket of her apron. Her hand, gnarled with age, slowly withdrew a small object. It was a carved wooden button, painted a faded, almost imperceptible red. The paint was worn thin in places, but the delicate carving was still visible. August made this, she said, her voice thick with emotion. He made them for Delia's Sunday dress. She loved them. I found it in the road that morning near the quarters, in July of 1867. It must have fallen off. I kept it. I don't know why, just kept it. She pressed the button into Edmund's hand. It was warm from her touch, a small, tangible link to a past that had been deliberately erased. The button, a simple token of love and craftsmanship, now carried the immense weight of a hidden tragedy. Edmund stared at it, then at the list of names, then at Ruth's tear-filled eyes. The truth, long buried, was finally beginning to surface, piece by agonizing piece. The full horror of what had transpired at Voss Hill was slowly, inexorably revealing itself. This story is getting intense, isn't it? Isn't? If you're on the edge of your seat, make sure to share this video with a friend and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The weight of the tin box, filled with its damning contents, felt heavier than any burden Edmund Voss had ever carried. The documents, Delia's journal, the list of names, and the small, faded red button from Ruth. They were not just pieces of paper and wood. They were the echoes of lives brutally silenced, a testament to a profound injustice. Edmund knew, with a chilling clarity, that he could not simply walk away. The surveyor in him demanded truth. The man in him demanded justice, however belated. His first step was to take the documents to the highest authority he could find, Judge Anson Whitfield in Jackson, Mississippi. Jackson, the state capital, was a bustling city, a stark contrast to the quiet, conspiratorial silence of Rayford. Judge Whitfield was a federal circuit judge, a man of stern demeanor and a reputation for upholding the law, even in the tumultuous years after Reconstruction. But the year was 1887. Reconstruction was officially over. Federal troops had long since withdrawn from the South, leaving the region to grapple with its own demons. The political environment was hostile, deeply resistant to any challenge to the established racial order, especially one that implicated prominent white families. Edmund presented his findings to Judge Whitfield in his chambers, laying out the documents with a meticulous precision that belied the turmoil in his soul. He recounted his investigation, the sealed well, the miasma report, the missing names, Ruth's testimony, and the chilling contents of the tin box. Judge Whitfield, a man accustomed to the grim realities of the post-war South, listened with a grave expression, his eyes scanning the brittle papers, his fingers tracing the names on Delia's list. The legal process that followed was extraordinary, exhausting, and ultimately incomplete. Judge Whitfield, despite his personal convictions, was operating within a system designed to protect itself. The wheels of justice turned slowly, grinding against the entrenched power structures of Mississippi. Edmund found himself facing a wall of bureaucratic resistance, veiled threats, and outright hostility. His contacts in Memphis, legal colleagues he had consulted, advised him to drop it. "You're stirring up a hornet's nest, Voss," one had warned. "Some things are best left buried." But Edmund could not. He was not a hero, not in the traditional sense. He was a troubled man, haunted by the ghosts of his father's past, who found himself unable to look away from the truth he had unearthed. He pressed on, providing testimony, answering endless questions, facing down the thinly veiled accusations that he was simply trying to discredit his own family name. The first tangible development came with the disappearance of Silas Pruitt. In October 1887, just as Judge Whitfield's office began to issue subpoenas, Silas vanished from Rayford without a trace. His cabin was empty, his few possessions gone. The town offered no explanation, only a shrug of collective ignorance. It was a convenient disappearance, a key witness removed from the board, further complicating Edmund's efforts. Then came the partial statement from Dr. Horace Gage. Now elderly and gravely ill, his health failing rapidly, Dr. Gage was compelled to appear before Judge Whitfield. His testimony was hesitant, riddled with fear, but it was a confession nonetheless. He confirmed that he had been present at Voss Hill in the summer of 1867. He admitted that conditions were not natural, a chilling echo of his original log entry. He confessed that he had signed the miasma report under immense pressure from Harlan Voss and parties associated with the Rayford Protective League. He spoke of threats, of the fear of reprisal, of the pervasive power of the League in the county. He died just days later before a full deposition could be taken, his partial confession a final, desperate act of conscience. Despite the obstacles, Edmund achieved a small but significant victory. In December 1887, a summary of the documents he had found, along with a brief account of his investigation, was published in the Memphis Daily Appeal. The article, though carefully worded to avoid direct accusations of murder, laid bare the facts. The sealed well, the missing people, the fraudulent report, the names. It ran once. It caused a brief stir, a ripple of outrage in some northern newspapers, but in the South, it was quickly dismissed as Reconstructionist propaganda or sensationalist fiction. It caused a brief stir, a flurry of whispers in the drawing rooms of Jackson and Memphis, but then, like so many inconvenient truths, it disappeared from the public consciousness. No formal charges were ever filed. No one was ever prosecuted. The land was never returned to anyone. The legal system, in its slow, deliberate way, had chosen to look away. But the names were published. Delia, August, Nora, Thomas, Clara, Hamp, Rosalie, Cornelius, Nettie, Martha, Samuel, and the three others. Their names, once erased, were now, however briefly, etched into the public record. It was not justice, not in the way Edmund had hoped, but it was a recognition. A whisper of truth against a roar of silence. The aftermath of the well's opening and the brief, unsatisfying legal skirmish left Edmund Voss a changed man. He did not sell the land to the Northern Company. He simply couldn't. He tried to explain it to his Memphis contacts, to the land agents who pressed him for a decision, but the words felt hollow, inadequate. How could he profit from ground that held such a terrible secret? From soil that had absorbed such profound injustice? A transaction, after everything he had found, felt obscene, a betrayal of the very truth he had fought to uncover. He had the well filled and sealed properly this time, not with a massive stone and iron spikes, but with earth and concrete, a final, respectful burial. It was a symbolic act, an attempt to bring a measure of peace to the disturbed ground, to acknowledge the lives that had been swallowed by its depths. He kept the tin box. He kept Delia's journal, or rather, Rosalie's careful handwriting rendering Delia's words. He never opened it again after that first agonizing reading. The words, filled with hope and quiet dignity, were too painful, too stark a reminder of what had been lost. He donated the other documents, the contract, the affidavits, the miasma report, Dr. Gage's partial confession, to the records of the Federal Circuit Court in Jackson. There they were filed, catalogued, and for the most part, forgotten, buried once more in the dusty archives of history, awaiting a future generation that might be willing to truly see them. Ruth lived until 1893, a quiet, dignified presence on the edge of Rayford. Edmund visited her twice after the article was published, making the long, dusty journey from Memphis. They would sit on her small porch, the air thick with the scent of pecan trees and unspoken understanding. They didn't say much. There was no need for words. Their shared knowledge, their quiet grief, bound them in a way that transcended conversation. Over the following decade, Edmund began to sell smaller parcels of the Voss Hill land. He did so quietly, without publicity, and at prices significantly below market value. He sold them to black farming families in Claiborne County, families who, like Delia and August, were trying to build something of their own, to carve out a life of independence on ground that had cost more than anyone should have to pay. It was